Son of a... Hey everybody, we're talking today about Shakespeare's play Richard III. Now Richard III is considered one of Shakespeare's history plays, even though the way that it presents characters and events are not necessarily in line with the actual historicity of the, oh, there's your college word for the day, historicity of characters and events. And we'll talk about why that is coming up here in just a few minutes, okay? Now, the play differs from most of Shakespeare's plays in that it really has just one plot, and that is Richard and what he does to get what he wants. There are no subplots, really. There certainly is no romance. I don't think that Richard's wooing of Lady Anne counts as romance. I mean, you can go look it up, I think, but I'm pretty sure you're going to find out that, yeah, no, not so much. And Richard himself is the center of the entire play. Richard is generally acknowledged as Shakespeare's first truly great character, and it's fascinating to watch Richard do his thing. Shakespeare outdoes himself up to this point in his career in his creation of Richard. Now, you may not like the character, hopefully you don't like the character, or at least you wouldn't like the person, but it is fascinating to watch him do his thing, and you're almost like, oh, I'll be damned, he pulled that off. Huh, how about that? Richard has more lines than any other character in Shakespeare's plays except Hamlet, and, you know, Hamlet. And Richard is, literarily, he's a descendant of Aaron the Moor from Titus Andronicus, in that Richard is just as evil. Maybe Shakespeare was just as evil too. I don't know. I never met him. Even though, I mean, I'm old, but I'm not quite that old. Am I? No. Okay. No, I'm not quite that old. And Richard III is, Shakespeare-wise, he is an ancestor of Iago, the villain from Othello, and he's an ancestor of Edmund the Bastard, in both senses, from King Lear, and he is an ancestor of Don John, also a bastard from Much Ado About Nothing. Hang on just a second. Come here. Okay. Now, I hold up this cat because, as we all know, cats are evil, even though we love them. Mwah. And the play deals in large part with the human capacity for evil. It's certainly about, you know, how much evil Richard is able to do and still live with himself. You know, late in the play, we get that sort of moment of reckoning that Richard has with himself, and we'll talk about that. It's also about the extent to which other people will go doing evil things if doing those evil things advances their own interests, okay? Buckingham is the most obvious example. Do you want down? Buckingham? No? Okay. Buckingham is the most obvious example, and he goes along with Richard's evil up until that point where he goes, oh, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. And that's kind of it for him and Richard. The play also is sort of about the interaction of human agency with the supernatural. And I say it's sort of about that because the supernatural that we see in this play, we also might say is not really supernatural, but psychological. For example, let me put down this cat. There you go. Go, be free, go forth, sin no more. She's not going to listen. Margaret's prophecies at Act 1, Scene 3. Are they prophecies? Margaret calls herself a prophetess, okay, but is she prophesying, or is she simply making observations that are shrewd and turn out to be accurate? Note that all of the predictions that Queen Margaret makes in Act 1, Scene 3, when she comes forth, angry at Richard and the Queen and all the assembled noblage, let's say that's a word, they're arguing, Margaret comes forth and says, "Hear me, you wrangling pirates, bitching amongst yourselves about what's actually mine." That's not what she says, that's a paraphrase, but you know, that's the gist. And all the prophecies that Queen Margaret makes come true. In Act 3, Scene 3, Rivers and Grey recall that Margaret prophesied their deaths. In Act 3, Scene 4, Hastings recalls Margaret's prophecies as he is being led to his death, and so on. And Richard demonstrates late in the play that, yeah, Margaret knew what she was talking about when indeed the worm of conscience gnaws Richard's soul. That's part of the prophecy that Margaret makes for him in Act 1, Scene 3. The worm of conscience gnaw thy soul. You gotta love Margaret. Historically, the play dramatizes the end of the Wars of the Roses. 1455 through 1485 is when that period took place. The Wars of the Roses was a struggle for the English throne. It was a fight for succession between two branches of the Plantagenet family. Yeah, that's a French name. It's because all of the English aristocratic lines, or most of them anyway, began with the French, the Norman French, who invaded in 1066, led by Conquerin' Bill, as his friends like to call him. And the two particular branches of the Plantagenet family that were at war, 1455 to 1485, were the Starks and the Lannisters. Wait, no, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Yeah, that's what it was. Anyway, the wars ended when, in 1485, the Earl of Richmond defeated Richard II, the third. He defeated some damn Richard, who was a York. And the Earl of Richmond took upon himself the name Henry VII, and the Earl then became the first in the Tudor line of monarchs, which leads from Henry VII up to Elizabeth I, who was the monarch during Shakespeare's day. And right there is a primary reason the play may not be quite historically accurate. And we'll talk more about that coming up here in just a little bit. Let's do a little more plot stuff and theme stuff first. We already talked a little bit about how Richard fits into the continuum of bad guys in Shakespeare's creations. In literature in general, Richard sometimes is regarded as an example or a descendant of the Vice. The Vice was a character type from the medieval morality play. Morality plays in the medieval and into the Renaissance periods were plays that dramatized moral and ethical dilemmas that a person faced while going through his or her life. The most famous morality play is Everyman. And Everyman, gosh, I wonder if that's a metaphorical title, like flashing neon metaphor. And in morality plays, the characters frequently are not meant to represent actual human beings, but to exemplify forces or situations that human beings might have to deal with. Some are named after sins. For example, the Vice represents the sin of vice, and Richard is sometimes seen as a descendant of that character type. Richard also is sometimes called a Machiavel, and the term Machiavel comes from it's taken from the name of Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a medieval Italian who wrote a book called The Prince, the title of which in Italian is... Anyway, The Prince is most widely known because of a misconception, a misinterpretation of what Machiavelli writes about in the book. In the book, Machiavelli makes the point that sometimes a leader will have to do things that are not popular, that might not even seem good, in order to accomplish a greater good. This idea was misconstrued and has been popularized as the end justifies the means. Whatever you want to do is fine as long as you get what you want. Well, no, that's not remotely what Machiavelli was talking about. And that deserves a whole lecture of its own, which I'm not qualified to give, so we'll just move on from there. Anyway, the title Machiavel, or the name, the label, is sometimes applied to Richard as well. And you can sort of see how Richard does fit that idea, because he will do anything in order to get what he wants. He starts off the entire play, right? Act 1, Scene 1, Line 1, and following, talking about how he's going to do whatever he needs to do in order to get what he wants, which is to be king. Because he, that is not shaped for sporting tricks, as it were, has nothing to do in peacetime. He's not good with the ladies, and he wants to be king. So he is going to do whatever he can to achieve that goal. And he says so. And that first speech that Richard gives, Act 1, Scene 1, Line 1 and following, is very memorable. There's some beautiful phrasing in there. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried, and yada, 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 yada. But I that am not shaped for sportive tricks, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionably that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to see my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, to entertain these farewells spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. So that's what he says, and that's what he does. This idea that Richard was hideously deformed is amplified in Shakespeare's play, because in the play, as in too much literature, the external appearance of a character somehow is supposed to embody their interior as well. Now, in life, we know that's not a thing, okay? But in literature, unfortunately, it is. So Richard's physical deformity is meant to give us a clue as to the moral deformity and depravity that lives within him. Okay, now please forgive me. I'm going to have to take a glance at my notes as we go through this next bit, because I don't want to misstate. We're talking about the prophecies, the predictions especially that Queen Margaret makes, and how they come true throughout the rest of the play. Okay, she foretells Richard's imminent demise. And Act 5, Scene 3 is the culmination of Margaret's cursing of Richard at Act 1, Scene 3. As Richard is sleeping in his tent before the big battle, in Act 5, Scene 3, ghosts come to him. They are the ghosts of the various people that he has murdered or had murdered. And indeed, as Margaret asserted, the worm of conscience does gnaw his soul. He wakes up and he has, in Act 5, Scene 3, that wonderful long passage about, is there a murderer here? No. Well, yeah, I guess there is. It's me. I love myself, though, and I hate myself. I suck. That's a paraphrase, as you know. But clearly, Richard is not carefree because of all that he has done. Buckingham, at Act 4, Scene 2, gets ripped off by Richard. Okay, and recall what Richard has done. He said to Buckingham, I want the bastards dead. He wants Buckingham to kill the two young sons of the king who has just died, King Edward IV. And Buckingham says, oh man, I need to think about this. Well, that's not what you say to Richard. And Buckingham, approaches Richard later and says, hey, I've made up my mind. Now, by the way, Richard, Dick, may I call you Dick? I'd like you to give me all the stuff that you promised. And Richard totally won't do it. And Buckingham realizes that he is in deep trouble, and he determines to get his butt the heck out of there. Buckingham has reached the limit of what he's willing to do for Richard's evil. Now, would Buckingham have gone ahead and killed the two princes? Dunno. Okay, that's kind of up in the air. But he signals to Richard that, yeah, he's decided whatever it is that he's decided. And if Buckingham has decided, if we are meant to read the character as having decided not to kill the princes, then we see that that's the limit, that's the extent to which Buckingham is willing to go before he stops. Now, if we read the character as having decided to go ahead and kill the princes, then the extent to which Buckingham will go is the point at which he realizes that Richard is going to kill him as well. But either way, we find Buckingham's limit there. It's one of those two limits anyway. The play almost begins, well, the first scene, we see Richard and his brother Clarence talking, and we learn that King Edward has been bothered by a prophecy that G will kill him and kill his heirs and so forth. And this is not, clearly you can't take this as psychology. This is a prophecy that has bothered the king. And Clarence, who, like most of Shakespeare's characters, is generally referred to not by his actual name, but by the name of whatever geographical locale over which he has dominion. That makes it sound really cool, doesn't it? Dominion. Clarence's name is George. So his brother, the king, thinks, oh, it must be George. Clarence, George/Clarence, who's going to kill me and kill my kids. So he has Clarence arrested. Now, of course, Richard is the Duke of Gloucester, and he's referred to as Gloucester many, many times by many other characters throughout the play. So exactly why the king would think that, I bet George is going to kill me, and not think that, I bet Gloucester is going to kill me. I don't know. I guess because it's convenient. Okay, now there's an interesting scene in Act 2, Scene 3 of this play. Okay, Shakespeare's plays generally are about princes and kings and dukes and that kind of thing. But Shakespeare, not infrequently, will stop and give us the perspective of your average Joe or average Jolene or average. Well, I guess if you just take Joe, it's a multi-gendered name. Just whatever you want to do with that E. And the citizens are talking amongst themselves, at least a few of them are, and they sort of culminate their conversation about what the powerful people are doing by saying, but leave it all to God, which is an interesting statement since Margaret in Act 1, Scene 3 had ended her rant and her prophesying by saying, I leave you all to the judgment of God. Now, that's a paraphrase, but that's essentially what she says. There are other bits that seem supernatural, other bits of prophecy and stuff in the play as well. Hastings' horse stumbling a bit as it leads him to what will be his final encounter with Richard. Clarence's dream about his own death, and then he wakes up and, son of a gun, he's killed, and so forth. Okay, so let's talk about what seem to be historical inaccuracies. Edward IV actually reigned for 20-ish years, yet in the play, it makes it seem as though he's king for only a few months. Clarence most likely got himself executed, probably for treason, rather than having Richard be the agent of his demise. We don't know why Lady Anne married Richard. She did in real life, but we don't know why. Maybe she actually loved him. Okay, but it does seem kind of weird marrying the guy who killed your husband and so forth, father-in-law and other folks as well. Also, in the third part of Henry VI, I think it's in Act 1, Scene 2. We have Richard, the character in that play, and I know we're not reading any of the Henry VI plays, but I'm just saying. We have the character Richard in that play comment upon how sweet it is to wear a crown. So, Shakespeare plants the seeds in his works generally that Richard for a long time wanted to be king, which doesn't seem to have been the case. Actually, it seems that Richard was a loyal and certainly a trusted steward of King Edward IV. When King Edward died, well, before he died, obviously, he named Richard Protector. The idea is that the Protector rules the kingdom until the young heir to the throne achieves his or her majority, means comes of age. Okay, and Richard seems to have done that. What appears to have happened is that after Edward IV died, Queen Elizabeth, not the Queen Elizabeth who's queen when Shakespeare is alive, but the Queen Elizabeth that was married to Edward IV, the Queen's family decided, awesome, we can now control the kid. We will have the kid named a king right away. Richard, we're going to do what we want. And they tried to rebel, and Richard put that down. And apparently Richard did this a couple of times. But at some point, Richard, for whatever reason, said, I'll just become king myself. And then he did. Now, maybe the biggest question of historical inaccuracy: was Richard as evil as he seemed? And was he in fact deformed? Well, we'll answer the second question first. Yes, but not nearly so horribly as the play suggests. Richard's bones were unearthed a few years ago underneath a parking lot in England. And his DNA was compared with the DNA of someone who is a direct descendant of Richard III, and this is known. And so they were like, yeah, these are Richard's bones. And he was a kind of hunchback. He had a pretty severe case of scoliosis. But when you consider the clothing that folks wear at that time, enormous robes and so forth, whether that would even be noticeable to the average observer is really open to question. Now, the other thing, was Richard as evil as the play makes him seem? Well, dunno, but he certainly wasn't a good guy. He seems to have been loyal to and trusted by Edward IV, but at some point Richard absolutely did. Richard apparently really did decide to be king. He probably had the two young princes killed. How could he not? He couldn't leave them just alive. And he did become king. So there's a whole movement that for a long time that's been based upon the idea that Shakespeare has grossly misportrayed Richard III, and Richard wasn't really this evil guy. This whole movement began with a novel in the first part of the 20th century that suggested that, in fact, Richard was a good guy, and history has just misinterpreted him. Well, historians generally think that, no, he wasn't that good. Okay, so why then did Shakespeare portray Richard as even more evil than he actually was? Well, we said earlier that Elizabeth I, Shakespeare's queen, direct descendant of the Earl of Richmond, who became Henry VII after he defeated Richard. Henry VII, direct ancestor of Elizabeth, and you don't want to go around, denigrating or otherwise saying bad things or portraying as bad people the family of your current ruler, because in Shakespeare's day, more bad things would happen to you than would happen now. Oh, sure, Elizabeth would say, hey, you have said bad things about my family, so I'm going to order all the royal offices not to subscribe to the Washington Post or the New York Times anymore. But then, she might well go on and you might have the thing done to you. So you don't want that. Political and social expediency and safety is why Shakespeare, a large reason anyway, why Shakespeare presents history through this play in a way that might not be entirely historical. So, y'all, that's what I have got for Richard III. And next we'll discuss some other Shakespeare play. I might want to use these videos in a future class as well, so I'll try to keep them generic. Talk to you soon.